There's a conversation that happens in every generation, usually quietly, usually with a mix of frustration and embarrassment, about why things feel so much harder financially than they were supposed to. Your parents bought a house in their late 20s. You're in your mid-30s and the deposit alone feels like a number from a different life. Your salary is reasonable. Your choices have been sensible. And still, the maths don't work the way they should. This is not a personal failure. It's a structural shift, one that has been happening for decades, that affects an entire generation, and that has a specific, explainable cause. This episode explains it, clearly, without blame, and without pretending the situation is simpler than it is. Ready to take your first real step? Buying your first bit of Bitcoin, $15, link in the description. When people talk about inflation, they usually mean one specific thing: the price of everyday goods going up, food, petrol, services. The things measured by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, that central banks report on and governments respond to. But there's a second kind of inflation that gets far less attention, measured less consistently, and has had a more profound effect on wealth distribution over the last 30 years. Consumer inflation, the kind everyone talks about, the rising cost of things you consume: groceries, fuel, electricity, a coffee, a haircut. It's the inflation you feel in your wallet every week. It's tracked. It's reported. It triggers policy responses when it gets too high. Asset inflation, the kind that rarely gets the same headlines, the rising cost of things you need to own: houses, investment property, shares, the assets that generate wealth over time. The things that, if you already own them, make you richer while you sleep, and if you don't own them, push further out of reach every year. Asset inflation is not consistently tracked the same way. It doesn't trigger the same policy responses. And for the last 30 years, it has run significantly faster than both consumer inflation and wage growth. That gap between how fast wages grow and how fast the assets people need to own grow is the core of what this episode is about. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to the money. From the early 1980s through to 2022, interest rates in most developed economies fell steadily, from double digits down to near zero. And in 2008, central banks around the world responded to the financial crisis by creating unprecedented amounts of new money and keeping rates near zero for over a decade. When money is cheap, when borrowing costs almost nothing, capital flows into assets, not wages, assets. Property investors borrowed cheaply and bought more property. Companies bought back their own shares. Pension funds poured money into real estate and equities, and asset prices, already rising, rose faster. Wages, meanwhile, grew slowly, as they have for decades. Because wages are set by productivity, negotiation, and the labor market, not by the availability of cheap money, and productivity growth has been modest, and worker bargaining power has declined. So wages crept up, while assets soared. Let's make this concrete. In Sydney, the median house price in 2000 was approximately $200,000. By 2024, it exceeded $1 million. That's a five-fold increase in 24 years. In London, similar story. In Toronto, in Auckland, in most major cities across the English-speaking world, and many beyond it, property prices have tripled, quadrupled, or quintupled since the turn of the century. Average wages over the same period roughly doubled in nominal terms, less than that in real, inflation-adjusted terms. So the same job, the same relative position in the workforce, the same level of seniority, earning the same proportion of the economy's output, now buys a fundamentally different relationship to property ownership. Your parents could save a house deposit in 2 to 3 years on a single income. In many cities today, a couple with good incomes saves for a decade and still struggles with the deposit, not because they're doing anything wrong, because the asset moved faster than the wages. That is not a personal failing. That is a structural outcome. And calling it a personal failing is one of the most common ways this conversation gets distorted. The asymmetry here is stark and worth naming clearly. If you owned property going into the era of cheap money, say if you bought in the 90s or early 2000s, you watched your net worth increase dramatically, without doing anything, without working harder, without taking any particular risk, just by having already been in the system. In many cities, a house bought in 2000 and held to today generated more total wealth than a career of professional wages. The passive return on the asset exceeded the active return on the labor. That's not a critique of the people who benefited. They made reasonable decisions with what was available to them. But it does clarify the mechanism. The system rewarded being in the asset class and penalized being outside it. For renters, for people who couldn't get into property when it was more accessible, or who came of age after it had already moved, the experience was the mirror image. As property values rose, rents rose with them. Investors who bought at lower prices needed rental income to service their mortgages, and as their asset values grew, their rental pricing power grew with it. Every year of renting while prices rose was a year of paying for someone else's asset appreciation, while your own deposit target grew faster than your savings. This is the Cantillon effect, which we covered in episode 12, playing out across an entire generation of housing. New money entered the system through banks and financial institutions. People close to that money, those who already owned assets, who had access to cheap credit, who could borrow and invest, benefited before prices fully adjusted. Those further from the money, renters, younger workers, people without existing assets, paid the price of the adjustment without receiving the benefit. The gap isn't closing on its own. And it won't close until the conditions that created it change significantly. This episode isn't a manifesto. It's not saying the system is irredeemably broken, or that there's a simple fix. There isn't. But understanding the mechanism, understanding why assets inflate faster than wages, in an environment of expanding money supply, is directly relevant to understanding Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an asset with a fixed supply. More money can't be created to dilute it. No cheap money era can cause its supply to expand. When new money enters the system and flows into Bitcoin, the supply doesn't increase to absorb it. The price adjusts instead. That's a different behavior from wages, which don't automatically rise when more money is created. And in that specific sense, as an asset that can't be inflated away, Bitcoin behaves more like property than like cash. Whether that makes it the right choice for your financial situation, not something this channel can answer for you, but it is part of the picture that helps explain why people who've been watching the asset gap widen for a decade are increasingly paying attention to it. The conversation about why rent has doubled but salaries haven't, ultimately a conversation about how money works, and who benefits when more of it is created. That's not a fringe question. It's the central financial question of this generation. And now you have a clearer framework for thinking about it than most people ever get. If you're someone who has done everything right, saved carefully, worked hard, made sensible decisions, and still feels like the maths don't quite work, you were right. The maths don't work the same way they used to. Not because of anything you did wrong, because of something the monetary system did, over several decades, that nobody explained to you clearly. Now they have. Ready to take your first real step? Buying your first bit of Bitcoin, $15, link in the description. Bitcoin for Girls the building of a beautiful future. See you in the next one.